The Mafia king wasn't supposed to care. That was the first mistake. The second was letting people see it. Because the second Adrian Moretti stepped out of that ballroom with a waitress, his enemies stopped watching him and started watching her. And what began as one act of mercy was about to turn into a war inside his own family.
Feels. You and I are going to unpack this scene together. We start with a striking shift in power dynamics, a ruthless mafia boss kneeling before a mere servant. Washington's elite froze as Adrian spoke 6 impossible words. Feels. Beneath the chandelier stood Laya Hart, trembling violently in borrowed heels. Her only goal was to stay invisible, but instead she became the obsession of a dangerous man. To understand this, we need to rewind. In a smoke-stained elevator, Feels. Leia pressed her forehead to the cold steel, fighting a desperate panic attack. Feels. 6 floors below the wealthy elite, the wait a simp grounding trick, counting backward from 10. A habit she learned in cancer wards. 10. 9. 8. The elevator jerked. 7. Her stomach turned over. First time working the Carrington, a raspy voice broke through her thoughts. Leia looked up. A veteran server named Margaret watched from the shadows, wearing the stiff armor of someone used to surviving. Is it that obvious? Leia asked. Feels. Margaret read her panic instantly, offering a hollow smile built on survival. Don't speak. If they grab you, she ordered. Smile and walk away, understand? Leia nodded. Leia Hart. The older woman sized her up. You're pouring champagne. To survive tonight, you must erase yourself entirely. Keep moving. In this world, anyone who freezes gets swallowed whole. The servants here are just ghosts, easily trampled. Feels. The elevator chime announced her arrival. Golden light washed over her. For a second, the sheer terror of the ballroom overpowered the grief she had carried since August. We must remember where this started. Finding her mother collapsed among shattered plates. Then came the sirens, the hushed doctors, and the devastating news. Stage 3 cancer. The hospital offered a treatment plan, but survival was a luxury only the wealthy could afford. Feels. Keeping her mother alive meant buying drugs far out of their price range, leading to endless insurance rejection letters. Once a brilliant university senior, Leia dropped out immediately. There were no tears, just the quiet death of her future inside a sterile campus office. Now, running on fumes across 3 minimum wage jobs, she stepped into this charity gala. This dangerous catering gig wasn't just a shift. It was the fragile thread keeping her mother breathing. Feels. $800 in cash, a lucky break born from a coworker's injury, and Margaret's surprising mercy. That money bought one more vital injection, the literal difference between life and death. Leia stepped onto the floor. The ballroom was a monument to staggering wealth, shining with massive crystal chandeliers. The guests here carried themselves with the cold, ruthless authority of true apex predators. Feels. Notice the atmosphere here. The air was heavy with expensive leather, designer perfume, and filtered oxygen. Gripping a tray of 12 glasses, she forced her shaking fingers flat and straightened her spine. She stepped into the crowd. In this dark social hierarchy, the working class are entirely stripped of their humanity. The rich see a uniform, not a person. A powerful politician could shove her aside without a second thought, treating her like nothing but moving furniture. Feels. Look at this shift with me. Leia detached from reality to survive the overwhelming room. She passed out drinks, while wealthy women snatched glasses without pausing their conversations. A drunk man bumped her hip. She flinched, but instantly flashed that forced, submissive smile, pure survival instinct. Halfway across the room, the very air shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden drop in pressure that would haunt her on countless sleepless nights. Feels. The chatter continued, but the room grew heavy, like the dead air before a thunderstorm. Following the crowd's gaze, she looked towards entrance. Adrian Moretti had arrived. Men with his level of power don't need an introduction. His mere presence demanded complete submission, silencing the wealthy elite. He was imposing, with dark hair and the sharp, unyielding features of a true apex predator. Feels. His tailored suit barely hid a dangerous coiled strength. Leia couldn't see his eyes, but her instincts screamed at her to run. The wealthy guests instantly looked away, avoiding his gaze like prey hiding from a hunter. 2 armed guards flanked him, Feels, radiating quiet, lethal violence. A woman nearby gasped at his arrival. Leia kept her head down, shrinking into her servant role. Every nerve in her body fired a warning. This man destroyed lives for sport. Feels. Making eye contact with him would be an absolute disaster. Feels. Survival instinct kicked in, and she slipped into the kitchen just to breathe. It was a roaring chaos of clattering pans. Laya leaned against the cold steel, trembling. Then her phone buzzed. A text from the nurse. Stop. Heart station at 6:42 p.m. stabilized, but call immediately. The blood drained from Laya's face. Her hands shook violently as she dialed the number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing but dead air. Heart! Feels. Margaret's sharp voice cut right through the noise. Get back out there. Laya tried to plead, choking out the news about her mother. For a split second, Margaret's tough exterior cracked, revealing an exhausted empathy. But just as quickly, Feels, her emotional armor snapped back into place. You have to finish your shift, Margaret ordered softly. Give me 20 minutes, then I'll cover your section. We have 300 guests and only 14 servers. Go. Laya simply nodded. Feels. Swallowing a sob, she grabbed a fresh tray of champagne and stepped back into the blinding ballroom. Feels. She couldn't hold back the tears. One slipped down her cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. The tray wobbled, the crystal glasses clinking loudly. Her vision blurred, her eyes glued to the floor just to keep from breaking down. Feels. This is where you and I need to pay close attention. This is the exact moment her world shatters. Looking up, she found her path blocked by Adrian Moretti. He stood completely alone. His guards had backed away, creating a terrifying void around him. Feels, and his dark eyes were locked entirely onto her. Feels. Her first instinct was to look away, just as Margaret taught her. Her second urge was to drop the tray and run. But remembering the hospital bills, she played the part. Notice the shaking in her hands. Champagne, sir? Her voice was barely a whisper. She swallowed hard and tried again. His eyes, completely empty of warmth, studied her face, glanced at the glass, and locked onto hers. He ignored the drink. You've been crying, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a cold fact. Feels. He delivered the observation with chilling detachment. No, sir, I'm fine. You are not fine. Panic flooded Laya's chest. Her instinct screamed at her as an invisible shield. Excuse me, sir, she whispered, trying to step around him. He didn't move an inch. He didn't even touch her. Yet his overwhelming presence paralyzed her completely. The glasses rattled on her tray. Who are you, sir? I'm really not. I don't want any trouble. Feels. I'm asking because I want to know. His voice was strangely quiet, every word measured like a weapon. Laya, she breathed. Exhausted, she didn't have the energy to lie. Laya Hart. He let the name sit in his mind. Then something happened before you walked back in here. Something devastating. Watch her reaction. Her vision starts to blur. The hospital, the silent phone, the crushing debt. She is on the edge of a total breakdown. Feels. So what do you and I make of this final moment? Leia entirely. Now look at Adrian, who controls everything, entirely unbothered. Where is she? Leia stammers. Sir, have to. Leia. He uses her name like a blade, freezing her in place. Where is she? Home. Alexandria. A bad reaction. When answering, simply falls apart in the middle of a glittering ballroom, gripping cheap champagne in front of a ruthless monster. Feels. Let us explore this character study together. Notice how Adrian wields power. He grabs his phone with the cold precision of an assassin. Tommy, he orders, asserting absolute control. Trace a medical line, dead for 20 minutes. Patient name, Hart. Feels. He studies Leia, weighing his new psychological captive. Eleanor, she yields. Eleanor Hart, Alexandria, Virginia. Get the absolute best doctor there in 15 minutes. Send a private ambulance as backup. Feels. Connect me to the ground team the second they arrive. Feels. The call ends. 20 seconds of pure dominance. Leia freezes. Sir, I do not know you. I cannot accept. You are not accepting anything, he dictates. Get your coat. We're going to your mother. Now, trauma creates a blackout. Leia forgets crossing the ballroom, yet her mind remembers bursting into the kitchen, keys biting her skin. She recalls her manager, Margaret, ready to yell, then choking back her words. The apex predator had blocked the exit. Feels. Total sensory suppression. Adrian embodies the lethal aura of a crime boss under harsh lights. Notice the manager's expression. Shock rapidly becomes a survival mask. Mr. Moretti, he nods Margaret. He catalogs every identity for future leverage. Feels. Miss Hart is leaving with me. Her pay is covered. Consider it a personal favor. He extends an arm. His fingers hover just above Laya's spine. Touch is unnecessary. He uses an invisible, coercive pull. Feels, dragging his fragile target into complete isolation. Heels. He guides her down a hidden corridor into the freezing November night. The air smells of rain and exhaust. A black car waits. The driver opens the door. Adrian does soundless vacuum, sparking deep claustrophobia. How is this possible, she whispers, trapped in cognitive dissonance. Adrian denies her any comfort. The phone returns to his ears. His voice turns violently sharp. Talk to me. A terrifying, controlled silence floods the space. Heels. How long was she unresponsive? What did they give her? No. I reject hospital protocol. Connect Dr. Rice in 4 minutes, or else. He hangs up. Passing lights cast harsh his predatory face, his eyes flat. Dangerous amber, we witness the heavy toll of endless hypervigilance on this man. Your mother is breathing, he states softly. Pulse is weak. The aide panicked during an allergic reaction to the infusion. That is all we know. Heels. A doctor arrives in 11 minutes. Notice Laya's physical state. Her hands shake violently from neurological overload. I do not understand, she cries. Why are you doing this? He holds eye contact, perhaps reflecting his own repressed trauma. Heels. Neither do I, he confesses. Not entirely. The car speeds down the parkway, the river blurring into a dark slick. The driver shows zero emotion. Adrian uses the silent treatment while Laya watches light smear across the glass. Heels, her breathing dangerously erratic. Heels. What disease does she have, he asks. She swallows the deep shame of financial ruin. Stage 3 lymphoma. We had a working treatment, but insurance denied it. We switched to the cheaper generic. How much was the premium drug? 4,200. Heels. Every 3 weeks. And the replacement? 800, which is why you were serving tonight. Yes. Adrian turns his gaze to the window. Notice the subtle clench of his jaw. Heels. It is the suppressed rage of an omnipotent man confronting a broken system he cannot instantly control. Heels. Okay, he murmurs, okay. Let us look at this pivotal moment together. Her physical tension completely melts away. This is the exact second trauma bonding takes root, as she transfers her survival instinct entirely to her captor. Heels. The scene cuts to a bleak Alexandria street, her tiny house, an empty chair symbolizing unresolved grief since 2009. The harsh porch light reveals an unmarked white van idling outside. Heels. 2 tactical operatives in black hold the perimeter in the freezing mist. One checks a radio. Heels. Those are our operatives, Adrian states. Do not be afraid. Okay, she breathes, showing absolute psychological submission. The driver opens the door. The freezing air triggers a physical stumble. The narcissist reacts instantly. Heels. His hand hovers over her arm. He plays the savior, refusing actual touch while asserting total spatial dominance. She forces her failing nerves forward, crossing the dead grass to open the front door. Inside, the imagery is grim. Heels. Her mother lies pale, breathing shallowly beside an IV drip. A doctor in wire-rimmed glasses works with chilling, psychopathic precision. Heels. A subordinate sits nearby, guarding unknown chemicals. Eleanor opens her eyes, locking onto her daughter. Oh, she whispers, her voice incredibly weak. Oh, honey, I am so sorry. Leiza's legs completely give out. She crawls across the carpet, heels, regressing into a childlike state. She buries her face into her mother, releasing a primal, agonizing wail. It is the sound of catastrophic emotional collapse. Eleanor's frail hand strokes Laya's hair. I am okay, she whispers. I am okay, baby. Heels. The doctor steps back. Adrian guards the doorframe, strictly playing his part as the untouchable observer. Heels. He studies them, projecting an emotion Laya cannot decode. Her threat detection is entirely offline. The megalomaniac has not shown such possessive fixation toward a woman in over a decade. Perhaps never. He turns, heels, retreating to the dark porch to create distance. Inside, Dr. Rice uses non-threatening eye contact. He slows his movements, mimicking a safe caregiver to lower Laya's defenses. He sits as Eleanor drifts back into unconsciousness. Heels. He delivers the facts smoothly. Your mother suffered a violent immune response to the substitute. Heels. This anomaly is statistically insignificant, a blind spot. The nurse lacked basic training, exhibiting a catastrophic flight assessment. She abandoned protocol to smoke outside. Moretti's men found her. Oh my God, Leia gags, processing the negligence. I do not handle grievances, Miss Hart, but report that agency. He slides a card across the wood. My direct line. If any crises occur within 72 hours, dial my number. Heels. Do not alert emergency services. Call me. I guarantee a response under 60 minutes to Rice. I cannot, she begs. Financial anxiety overriding logic. I cannot fund this, Miss Hart. He tapped up, applying a psychological anchor. Just dial if she worsens, concludes. He packs up, pausing at the exit. She survives this cycle. The timeline is volatile, but tonight she is stable. Alone, Leia stares at a mug, paralyzed by trauma. Adrian holds the perimeter outside. Heals. His clothing offers no warmth, yet his mind ignores the cold. He watches the dark asphalt. Holiday lights cast a ghostly blue radiation. Leia steps out, crossing her arms in a textbook self-soothing gesture. Dr. Rice is highly competent. Heals. Adrian states, never breaking his gaze. He confirms and she survives this cycle. Good. Mr. Moretti, Adrian. Those syllables require immense cognitive effort. I lack the vocabulary to respond. Do not speak, he instructs quietly. Heals. The psychological damage is severe tonight. Retreat inside. Monitor her. I will hold this position or leave if I cause distress. Heals. Both options are acceptable. Why are you doing this? He finally turns. The light exposes his severe fatigue. What are you and I truly seeing? The cellular exhaustion of a man dropping a decade-long defense mechanism. I gave my theory earlier, he murmurs. Heals. I lack a definitive motive. That is an illogical answer. Yes, it is. They stand in silence. Her breath crystallizes in the freezing air. His chest barely moves, a visual distortion, but her hyper-aroused brain records it. May I offer a confession? Okay. Heals. I attended tonight strictly out of obligation. Heals. Today, you and I are going to unpack his confession. The mission was simple. Show, force, fuse, and leave. A purely transactional existence. Then a waitress crosses his path. Her hands shake, tears dry on her cheeks, and suddenly, feels the machine breaks. His words falter. He exhales, a heavy sigh tearing through his defenses. He cannot calculate why her grief anchors him. He witnesses pain daily and walks right past it. So why step in tonight? The math fails him. Feels. Maybe you should have kept walking, she suggests. But he offers a rare, unguarded smile. A weapon completely disarmed by a single tear. Heals. We see a fascinating visual here. This tiny softening in his eyes is so foreign that Leia nearly steps back. Maybe I should have, he whispers. She retreats indoors. Sinking to the floorboard, she clings to her mother's fragile frame. Heals. Anchoring herself until the older woman's chest rises and falls in a steady rhythm. When sleep finally takes her mother, Leia stands. Her joints ache. She checks the window. The black car hasn't moved. 2 guards hold the line. The doctor is gone. Heals. Blue holiday lights cast a cold, sorrowful glow. Outside, Adrian leans against cold steel, plugging back into his violent underworld. Heals. Through the glass, Leia watches his posture snap tight. His shoulders turn to stone. He listens, sparks a reply, and violently drags a hand through his hair. The call ends. He freezes. Then he looks dead at her window. The predator always feels eyes on his back. Leia yanks the curtain shut. Panicking, she rubs the doctor's card raw, begging for comfort. Heals. Down the hall, her mother sleeps peacefully. Faint Italian echoes from the street below. You and I see this all the time, the exact moment a normal life shatters. 3 hours ago, Leia poured coffee. Now mob soldiers hold her block. A ruthless kingpin stands in the cold, burning endless resources to cage a girl he just met. Crushed by the sheer weight of it all, Leia buries her face in her hands. Feels. Mom, what have I done? She whispers. Eleanor sleeps, breathing only because a monster played savior. Seeking warmth, Leia pulls her mother's cardigan tight and steps back outside. Adrian pushes off his car. She's asleep, Leia says. Good. The doctor ordered a private nurse, he replies, his voice freezing over. The agency nurse isn't coming back. I handled them. Step by step, Leia surrenders her agency to his absolute control. Feels. My nurse is on the way, he tells her. Leia just stares. Logic screams at her to ask the price, to question who he really root. Beneath her terror lies a dark truth. She wants the wolf to stay. Why did you run your hand through your hair? She asks. Adrian blinks. Earlier, she presses, pushing at his armor. You were ice cold with the doctor, gentle with me. But after that call, you looked completely dead inside. Feels. Who called? She asks. He lets the silence hang, heavy and deliberate, before answering. My uncle. We run a family business. He found out I was playing guard dog for a waitress in Virginia. What did you tell him? That I was saving day? Adrian stares up at the pitch-black sky. Look closely. This is the trap snapping shut. He said I just painted a target on your back. His face hardens into stone. And he's absolutely right. Feels. This is textbook isolation. He is cutting off all her exits. Leia's heart pounds wildly. As she pulls the sweater, she asks. My enemies, he replies. People who just realize that. For the first time in my life, I actually care about someone. Do you understand? She sees the cage closing around her. She nods slowly. I didn't plan this, he lies, wearing a mask of raw vulnerability. Don't think I wanted to walk away holding your entire life in my hands. Feels. I hold your fate, and I can't let go, he tells her. Then let go, she whispers, her defenses crumbling. Go home. They already know about you, he fires back. We'll move, she begs. Laya, he drops his voice to a devastatingly gentle whisper, dropping the emotional anchor. Outrun my monsters without me. Then what? She cries. You let me handle it. She breaks down, surrendering to the dynamic. He just watches her weep, keeping his distance to cement his ultimate power. Feels. He watches her with carefully crafted pity. Go inside, he orders softly. My guys own this street now. Nothing gets close to you. Adrian. Tomorrow I come back in the daylight, he says, planting the seed for his next move. I'll sit at your kitchen table. I will explain exactly how ugly my world gets and the deadly cost of being near me. And then, Laya, I will ask if you want to be part of this tragedy. Feels. I'll accept whatever you decide, he promises. Frozen by perfect Lucius nods. He gives a slow, theatrical bow, steps into his car, and vanishes into the dark Virginia night. Left shivering on the porch, Laya stares into the empty street, her mind entirely broken. At 12:23 a.m., Catalina shows up. This iron-faced woman carries heavy trauma kits, a brutal reminder of the mob's endless money and power. Feels. Catalina checks her mother's pulse with cold military precision. Stepping into a dark, motherly role, she forces Leia to eat. Get some sleep, the nurse commands, claiming the armchair. Tomorrow is going to cost you. I can't, Leia whispers. If trouble comes, I will wake you, Catalina promises. Leia's in her bedroom. Drowning in trauma exhaustion, she collapses onto her bed, still wearing her dirty catering uniform and shoes. She just stares at the ceiling, utterly numb. Feels. Moonlight hits the doctor's card. Leia fixates on the soft, broken mask her captor wore. His promises spin in her head, the poison of the trauma bond sinking deep. She imagines a faceless mob boss hunting a simple waitress. Sleep never comes, but she falls into a twist-romanticized comfort, finding safety in the very monster who caged her. Outside, the black sedan waits. 2 armed soldiers sip coffee in the freezing air, guarding her street like a fortress. Feels. The killers outside don't speak a word. 32 miles away, Adrian stands in his penthouse overlooks a glass of amber liquor in hand. His mind plays Leia's crying face on an endless obsessive loop. He knows the war with his uncle is coming. Blood will spill. But underneath the cold sociopathy, a very real twisted attachment is taking root. He is watering a seed of vulnerability he can no longer crush. Feels. He obsesses over one fact. She asked him for absolutely nothing. In a world built on bloody favors, that is incredibly rare. He kills his drink, slamming the glass against cold marble. Down below, pleats bleed. It's the quiet dawn of a Mafia war. The knock finally comes at 9:04 a.m. Laya gave up on sleep hours ago, her mind entirely swallowed by his psychological conditioning. Feels. We see this decay happen fast. Laya showers, desperately trying to scrub the panic from her skin. Wrapped in her mother's sweater, she nervously twists her hair up and down, completely stripped of her own power. In the mirror, she hunts for the beauty her captor supposedly sees. She finds only dark circles and broken eyes. In the kitchen, Catalina makes coffee, totally blind to the Mafia trap. Her mother does a crossword puzzle, ignoring Laya's frantic pacing. Feels. Let's piece this scene together, shall we? Sweetheart, Eleanor murmurs, focused on her puzzle. Keep floating around like a ghost, and I'll ask the nurse to knock you out. Mom, I'm serious. That man saved my life. Feels. And I'm not going to drop dead right now just to be dramatic. A weak, exhausted laugh escapes Leia's chest as she sinks onto the sofa. Her mother grabs her shaking hand in pure silence. She knows exactly when to offer comfort and when to shut up. Then, feels. The knock hits the door, 9:04. Leia floats across the floor, frantically smoothing her worn sweater to calm her racing heart. She opens the door. Adrian stands there, wildly unguarded. No armor. His dark coat hangs open, no muscle behind him. Feels. He just holds a little pastry box, rain dripping from his dark hair. Feels. Look at how seamlessly the predator changes his skin. In the gray light, the ruthless mob boss is completely gone. He plays the role of a weary, harmless man bringing breakfast. Good morning, his deep voice rumbles. Can I come in? Yes, come in. Feels. He brushes past her, smelling like winter rain and cedar wood. In the kitchen, Catalina simply stands. She gives a tight nod. It's the stare of someone who knows exactly how many bodies he's buried, yet feels zero fear. Adrian nods back, feels, sliding the box across the counter. For your mother, he murmurs. The almond ones, feels. Tell her I remembered, Adrian says. Catalina offers a faint smile, calling him a thoughtful boy. I try, he replies. You do not try enough, she shoots back. Also true, he concedes. From the sofa, Eleanor watches, feels, dissecting the exchange with terrifying sharpness. As a matriarch, she wears an armor of hyper-vigilant distrust. No man has successfully played her in 30 years. Knowing this, Adrian treads lightly. He drops the cheap charisma. Instead, feels. He maintains a respectful distance, stepping several feet away to bow. Mrs. Hart, I am Adrian Moretti. I am relieved to see you recovering. Mr. Moretti, Eleanor responds. Her voice is physically broken, but her mind is an absolute fortress, feels. She runs a swift, clinical calculation, balancing the apex predator standing in her living room against the raw empathy he clearly feels for her daughter. I understand I have you to thank for the private doctor, the nurse, feels, and apparently half the armed guards in Washington. Mom, please, he is right there. He knows exactly what he did. Adrian offers a real smile. It is only the second time Leia has seen this crack in his armor, feels, melting his brutal nature into something terrifyingly magnetic. Mrs. Hart, he says softly, everything I arranged last night was tragically overdue. Your daughter is remarkable, feels. She has been carrying a massive weight that was never meant for her shoulders, feels. Let's pause and unpack this sequence together, because it is an absolute masterclass in tension. Eleanor measures him from her pillows, her mind razor-sharp in the shadows.
I am glad I could help,
Adrian says. You talk well, she observes. Practice, feels, he admits. Her eyes narrow as she orders them to the kitchen for coffee, promising to pretend she cannot hear them. Understood, he replies. Good boy. She returns to her mental chessboard. Standing in the doorway, feels. A realization hits Leia like a freight train. Her mother just x-rayed the soul of Adrian Moretti and decided to hold her fire, for now, feels. The lens now shifts to the kitchen. Leia pours coffee, desperately trying to hide her shaking hands as she sets the mugs on the heavy oak table. Adrian takes off his coat and sits down, his sheer gravity anchoring the room, feels. A brutal slice of morning sunlight cuts across the table, drawing a clear boundary between their two worlds. For a painful minute, the silence suffocates them. He studies her physical panic, watching her fingers tremble, feels. She refuses to look up from the rising steam. Last night I promised to show you exactly who I am, Adrian whispers. I am doing it right now, stripped of every charming mask, feels. I want you to hear the ugly truth directly from me, he says. He grabs his mug. Look closely at his massive, perfectly steady hands marked by a jagged white scar on the thumb, a permanent stamp of past violence she missed before, feels. My bloodline started in Calabria in 1922, he begins. 4 brothers built an empire over 40 years. Society gave it a frightening name, but names mean nothing to the facts. By the time I was born, the machine was massive, feels. Locked down by strict tribal law, construction waste routes, transit lines, a chunk of Baltimore Harbor, and a bleaker southern port, feels. For decades, running those docks required spilling blood and spinning lies. Less so lately, but still enough to ruin lives. Leia squeezes her mug, her raw stress turning her knuckles completely white. And you run this whole machine? She asks, feels. A massive piece of it, yes, he admits. My father died when I was 26. My uncle wanted the throne. After a very specific negotiation, I took the crown, pushing him to the edges. We keep a shaky piece, mostly. Mostly, she pushes, feels. It means he calls me at midnight, hinting that me standing on your porch turns you into a target, feels. The tension finally boils over. Have you hurt people? She asks, her voice tight. Watch his body language right here. He does not flinch or blink. He holds her gaze, refusing to sugarcoat his monstrous past. I have killed. I have ordered men to die, feels. Twice in my younger years, I pulled the trigger myself. It has been 14 years since I got my own hands dirty, but that comes from power, not sudden morality. The king outsources the killing. Hear me clearly. I am not pretending my soul is clean, feels. It is rotten to the core, feels. She drifts away for a second, lost in the steam. Yesterday, his danger was just an abstract idea she could study from afar. Now, the monster is sitting at her own kitchen table, destroying any illusion of safety. Panic floods her system, feels. She slams the mug down to hide how badly her hands are shaking. Then why are you here, she whispers. Because I gave you my word, he answers. Because I owe you the complete ugly truth about who I am. And because if you draw a line and banish me right now, feels, I will walk out that door, feels. I will keep my uncle away from you. You can go back to the quiet, lonely life you had before I ruined it. My old life was just watching my mother slowly die because we could not afford medicine. She fires back, letting her deep trauma spill out. Heals. He takes the emotional hit without throwing up a shield. I know. Did you pay for her treatment yesterday? I will, he states. I will cover her medical care forever, even if you never speak to me again. This is not a transaction, Leia. If you tell me to leave, Heals, the doctors stay. Heals. Stick with me here, because we need to examine this brilliant psychological pivot. Watch his hands. He rotates the mug a quarter turn, studying the ceramic like he is reading his own fatal diagnosis. I am 41, he murmurs. Heals. Groomed since I was 9 to take this poisoned crown. I am very good at my job, but lately the silence in my head is deafening. For years I have been playing my own family in the dark, quietly washing our dirty money. Heals. I am dismantling our bloody empire to build clean businesses that can survive the light of day. Heals. Building an honest legacy that a future child could inherit without constantly checking over their shoulder. I have hidden this plan from my uncle, my soldiers, and the women I have dated. Why dump all this truth on me, she asks. Because yesterday, Heals, you broke my mental model. You did not act like the terrified prey I am used to crushing. You did not reflect the hollow greed of my inner circle. You were just a broken daughter, crying openly, treating me not like a mob boss, but like a man. Heals. It cracked open a door inside me that had been nailed shut for 15 years. Heals. We watch Leia's emotional dam finally burst. Tears spill over, crushed by the sheer psychological weight of his confession. Adrian, I dropped out of school and I pour coffee for a living. I have $900 to my name. I own nothing. Heals. I do not belong anywhere near your wealthy, blood-soaked world. I do not know how to survive in your society. I do not care about society, he cuts in. But the wolves in your circle will care. She fires back, furiously wiping her face. Heals, that is the cold truth. Do not try to play me. Heals. He watches her cry, his hands firmly planted on the table. This brutal display of self-control tears down walls faster than if he had reached out to hold her. Last night, she whispers, your uncle called me this time, Adrian. He lets out a jagged breath, rubbing his face like a man crushed by years of exhaustion. There are 3 rival families watching my throne, held back only by a very thin truce. Right now, one of them is begging for an excuse to start a war. Heals. Any wrong move, any sign of a beating heart. The second they realize, I care about an unprotected civilian with a sick mother, the sharks will circle. They probably will not kill you outright, but they will shadow you. They will hold your mother's medicine hostage to force you to betray me. And if you refuse to play their game, they will break your bones next. Do you understand exactly what kind of hell this is? Yes, she breathes. Worse, the rot inside my own house will spread. I can handle my uncle. Heals. My cousin is a pure textbook narcissist. He genuinely believes the crown is his by blood. If he senses that you make me weak, he will try to rip the throne away. He will not aim at you. He will aim at me. Heals. Using your existence as the perfect excuse to put a bullet in my head. I know I sound completely paranoid, Leia. Do you? He finally breaks his stony gaze. Caught in the harsh sunlight, his eyes reveal an agonizing, Heals, bottomless isolation. A man who has lived in the dark so long it has poisoned his blood. Yes, he whispers. Heals. So what do you and I make of this final move? He dresses his gamble up as vulnerability. He uses the pastries to soften the reveal of his monstrous nature, silently begging her to stay. She asks if it is an order. He pivots instantly, downplaying his power. He claims he just wants her to see the man beneath the Mafia armor. Just one dinner. It is a stunning display of coercive control. He hands her the pure illusion of choice: submit to his world or face the terrifying sudden silence of his absence. Heals. Today, let's step back and watch this tragedy unfold together. Adrian warns that obedience comes with a heavy mental cost. Leia just stares at her shaking hands, her stress boiling over into a physical tremor. Right behind her, Eleanor hides behind a rustling newspaper. We see the scars here. Her mother unconscious on the floor, surrounded by broken plates. Contrast this with Adrian at the estate, securing loyalty with the cold detachment of a predator. Heals. Staring at his scarred thumb, Leia falls right into a classic trauma bond. She finally breathes. Adrian freezes with his coffee mug halfway up. She admits she actually wants him around, terrified of being abandoned and drowning in old regrets. He just gives a slow, heavy nod. Thursday tells her he is sending a car to take her somewhere hidden, off the grid. Stripped of all choices, Leia practically whispers her surrender. Heals. He lays out the rules of her cage. Cars will watch her home, calls monitored. He spins this stalking as total protection, a classic manipulator flipping reality. Leia just nods. He tosses her a fake way out, swearing it is not a prison. Standing, he grabs his heavy coat. With chilling, effortless charm, he politely thanks her for the coffee. Feels. "Thank you for my mother," she replies, sealing her own trap. He just studies her like a god. Stepping close, he stops just inches away to assert total dominance. The harsh overhead lights show his messy stubble, a rare crack in his armor. "Lila Hart," he whispers, locking her identity to his obsession. He turns heavy boots, thudding away to say goodbye to Eleanor. The deadbolt clicks lock. Leia is left alone in the quiet, her heart hammering wildly. Feels. Eleanor keeps her eyes glued to the paper and tells Leia to sit. Leia just collapses onto the couch. Eleanor reaches out, wrapping her warm hand around her daughter's freezing fingers, anchoring her back to reality. She admits she heard the whole conversation. She lays out a brutal truth. He is a walking death sentence, but maybe the only thing that can save her. She perfectly captures the terrifying double edge of violent men. Feels. Leia begs for advice. Eleanor just rubs her hand in slow circles, while cars park outside to watch the house. She will listen, but she refused to save Leia from her own bad choices. She thinks Adrian's obsession comes from a crushing, lonely darkness. He sees a flicker of life in Leia. He is paranoid, terrified of actually feeling empathy for once. Eleanor believes Leia somehow slipped past his walls, exposing how exhausted he really is. Feels. Let's pause here and look at what makes this so dangerous. Eleanor asks if Leia is just exhausted. She is. Eleanor spots the real poison here. Two broken people clinging to each other to survive. She paints a terrifying picture together. Either they find destroy each other. Nothing in between. Leia admits she is terrified. Clearly understands. Leia buries her face in her mother's shoulder, acting like buried in her mother's tray like a scared little kid trying to wake up from a nightmare. Feels. They hold each other tight while Catalina watches from the shadows. Morning breaks, cold and ordinary. Outside, the trap is set. The guys inside pretending to read the news. Thursday blurs past. By Sunday, Leia is serving coffee at the diner, pretending everything is completely normal. Then the illusion shatters. Looking through the dirty window, she spots the same blue truck from her street. The watchers are everywhere. Feels. Now the conditioning really begins. Monday on the bus, a woman in a tan coat stares a little too hard at a blank phone. Tuesday night walking home, two guys smoking under a broken street lamp give her a silent nod. But Leia does not panic. Instead, something deeply twisted happens inside her. The constant gnawing fear of walking the city's streets alone simply vanishes. Her natural instinct to run has been totally erased. Feels. She is never alone anymore. And the real tragedy? She actually starts to crave the cage. On Wednesday, she makes the call, sensing something is wrong. She asks about the ghosts following her. She asks about the ghosts, the woman on the bus. She asks if they are forever. He gives a cold yes. They stay until his enemies figure out she is not a weak spot they can use against him. Feels. He promises the watchers will fade into the background, but they will never leave. She agrees, but her shaking voice gives her away. We see her standing by the window, watching a stray eat trash in the alley, totally blind to her nightmare. "I'm terrified of how safe I feel," she whispers to the glass. A heavy silence drops. Adrian quietly asks her to repeat that. She confesses her lack of fear feels entirely wrong. Feels. She expected sleepless nights and panic attacks. Instead, she is finally sleeping through the night. She knows there are killers guarding her front door, and it comforts her. The poison is changing who she is. She thinks she is broken for wanting the monster. Adrian immediately shuts that down. He demands she listen. She has spent her whole life broke and exhausted, taking care of everyone else. He frames his total control as a rescue mission, refusing to call their toxic bond a sickness. Feels. He calls it pure relief. She hates herself for needing him, terrified of loving her captor. A sharp silence fills the line. A ticking clock echoes inside his corrupt corporate tower. Finally, he speaks. He reveals his own empty life, a world built entirely on fake trust. People only follow him out of fear or greed. Even his family is a tool. Feels. His ego takes over. He tells her he will not lose a wink of sleep if she falls for him. He claims his real demons live somewhere else, demanding she understands that. She agrees. He sets the time. Set where? What you want. He tells her to dress warm, a strange flash of actual care before hanging up. You and I both know exactly how this story ends. She is permanently trapped inside his glass box. Feels. Watch this moment closely. The stray cat finishes eating and runs off. At exactly 6:57, a quiet knock hits the Darko. His face is a roadmap of old scars, and he never speaks. She climbs into the car, rubbing her old coat to calm her nerves. The city lights blur past. Meanwhile, Adrian waits in a hidden room across town, playing the spider in his web. Feels. The building has no signs, meant to keep her totally lost. As she steps into the shadows, Adrian stands. He wears normal clothes, trying to look human. For a second, she barely recognizes him. The monster is hiding, playing the gentle friend. He greets her. She questions her own free will. A disguised guard drops off food and vanishes. He pulls out her chair. The trap finally slams shut. Feels. A flickering candle illuminated the silver in her fragile wrist. Notice the profound suppression of their reality here. They avoided all Mafia terminology. No mention of targets or the Victorio bloodline. Instead, for 2 hours, Feels, they engaged in mutual trauma bonding. They unpacked the ghosts beneath their skin. Her father, a teacher, died of heart failure at 49. His mother, lost at age 6, reduced to a fading memory. Feels. They even analyzed a textbook she obsessively reread. They were exposing psychological wounds, not criminal empires. Feels. He detailed the horse he sold at 17 to enter his violent family enterprise. They contrasted this with her mundane coffee habits. He noted his espresso restriction, Feels, mandated after a doctor warned him at 36 that his own heart would terminate him before any rival could. "Did you change?" she probed softly. "Some things. I abandoned whiskey. I walk." Feels. "I purchased an undisclosed Virginia property entirely hidden from my syndicate. A sanctuary of absolute isolation. I am disclosing this because it holds weight." He was testing her capacity for trust. Feels. "Why?" "Because I would like to take you there, eventually if you wish." Observe her acute physiological stress response here. Leia fixed her gaze on the porcelain, her throat constricting in panic. She offered one rigid nod, Feels, lacking the vocal control to speak. Adrian detected the micro-expression of fear. He demonstrated clinical restraint, raising his glass and redirecting their focus to a stray cat. She emitted a fragile, nervous laugh, Feels, noting she named the animal Howard after a Washington Post newspaper. Adrian mirrored her with a surprisingly genuine laugh. For the remaining hours, they suspended their pathological roles. Feels. Following the session, Marco drove her home. Adrian exhibited atypical restraint by not pursuing her into the dark. A vulnerable fracture in her psyche actually expected him to. Instead, he simply opened her car door. Feels. He stood on the curb while the engine idled, offering a rigid, solemn salute. He held that posture, an isolated silhouette, until her vehicle vanished. Insomnia set in, triggered by an entirely novel psychological threat. Feels. Restless beneath a ticking ceiling fan, illuminated by orange streetlights, her conscious mind registered a singular, terrifying thought. "Oh no." Feels. "You and I recognize the clinical onset of this terror." "Oh no," she reasoned with chilling clarity. "I am in very serious trouble." This cognitive dissonance persisted from 2 in the morning until 4. He never initiated physical contact. Feels. No hands, no touch, no kiss. He maintained distance across 3 separate environments. Yet he radiates the most overwhelming dominance I have ever encountered. I am doomed. This is the foundation of her psychological capture. Meanwhile, Feels. 32 miles away in his glass fortress, Adrian Moretti studied the dark Washington skyline, obsessively plotting to manipulate his reality. Feels. For the first time, acute psychological dread paralyzed him. She is going to love me back. His behavioral conditioning prepared him for violent outcomes: war, betrayal, incarceration, assassinations, and late-night emergencies. Feels. He possessed no coping mechanism for reciprocal attachment. He remained frozen at the window. A distant door closed. A siren faded into the background. He rested his heavy forehead against the cold glass. Feels. Closing his eyes for one labored breath to regulate his nervous system. Then he returned to his desk. His uncle was calling. Adrian Moretti's brief period of stability was facing violent termination. Feels. The audio exchange lasted 11 agonizing minutes. 11 minutes that completely rewired their behavioral matrix. Adrian maintained a standing posture, recalling his uncle's psychological anchor. Sitting during a crisis signals submission. Feels. "Adrian Zoe, are you isolated?" "Yes." "Good. Process this carefully. I am keeping my vocal tone flat. I speak as your late brother out of deep familial attachment. I must deliver the trauma. I am processing." Feels. A tribunal is scheduled for Sunday at the Chesapeake property. Victorio forced the issue. He successfully manipulated the necessary votes. Heels. 5 of the 9 variables. Benedetto, Carmine, Ricci, Santino, and I apologize, Adrian, your cousin Renata. Adrian physically reacted to the betrayal trauma, closing his eyes. Renata defected. The formal grievance, hand-delivered 2 hours prior, Heels, challenged his mental competence to lead under their rigid syndicate codes. His uncle lowered his pitch to convey fatal consequence. You understand this pathology. Adrian, I will ask once. Does this subject justify mass casualties? Heels. Adrian paralyzed. Beyond the glass, he observed the Arlington darkness, the Potomac River reflecting light like a surgical scalpel. Heels. A dark boundary dividing the district. Miles away above a dry cleaner, Leia exhibited mild dissociation, staring blankly at her ceiling fan. Adrian lacked visual contact, yet his limbic system tracked her entirely, seeking her psychological warmth. Heels. I lack the data, he admitted. Do not fabricate. I am not. Zoe, analyze the timeline. 6 days. 2 verbal exchanges. 1 meal. Claiming she justifies violent conflict is irrational, and you would deem me unstable. Honestly, the data is incomplete. Heels, but I recognize her potential value. Heels. I constantly process the crushing urge to abandon this hierarchy. But if Vittorio successfully deposes me, my psychological evaluation of her terminates. That would permanently fracture an ego state I have aggressively defended. A heavy Heels. Clinical silence dominated the frequency. That is the most unfiltered truth you have vocalized in 11 years, his uncle diagnosed. But it offers no survival advantage. Sunday guarantees massive trauma, Adrian. Heels. A megalomaniac narcissist like Vittorio does not seek a democratic vote. He requires grand psychological theater. He demands the subject in the room. Heels. Look closely at this behavioral stress test, you and I. Adrian physically manifested his anger, clenching his fist against the wood. Negative, he exercises zero authority over her. Process my words, his uncle instructed. Refuse, Heels, and he weaponizes her absence. He will frame her as a pathetic liability, paralyzed by our violence. That cognitive poison will infect the council. However, Heels, if you present her, and she tolerates the stimuli for 60 seconds without a panic response. His manipulation fails. The psychological framing reverses. The dominant narrative becomes, Adrian introduced a civilian to apex predators, Heels, and she maintained absolute baseline, Heels. Zoe, she sustains 3 labor-intensive jobs just to prevent her mother's mortality. Her caloric intake is severely compromised. She is 5'6" and entirely unconditioned for sociopaths like Vittorio, Benedetto, and Ricci, Heels. You must determine your confidence in her stability. Adrian used silence as an interrogative tool. Outside his controlled environment, a helicopter moved north, a flashing red stimulus, Heels. He visualized Laya's involuntary hand tremors around her coffee mug. He cataloged the intense, unyielding eye contact she maintained while granting consent at her kitchen table, Heels. I will initiate contact tomorrow, he stated. Adrian, I desperately hope her resilience is genuine. Document the prolonged auditory absence between them, the weight of irreversible trauma. I hope she is highly functional. Because if she fractures, Heels, your mental state will collapse, and my protective capacity is 0. His uncle hesitated, descending into a state of mournful resignation. If her fortitude is real, I will validate her on Sunday. You are my brother's offspring, Heels. Whatever variable you introduce to that space, I will defend. But you require clinical certainty, Adrian, not optimism. Good night, Nepot. Good night. The connection terminated. Observe the subject now, Heels. Adrian remains paralyzed in the dark, clutching the plastic receiver obsessively, experiencing acute claustrophobic symptoms as his controlled reality shrinks. Heels. He navigated the low-visibility office, pouring a lethal dose of the bourbon his physician explicitly banned. He consumed the depressant in a single motion, striking the glass hard against the desk. Then, motivated by severe fatalistic impulses, Heels, he violated his own primary behavioral rule. He initiated the call, 2:14 in the morning, shift focus to Arlington. Inside Laya's pitch-black environment, the mobile device illuminated the dark. She was entirely conscious, Heels, trapped in a hyper-vigilant thought spiral. She intercepted the signal instantly. Adrian, did I interrupt your sleep cycle? No. Good. Note the crushing auditory void that followed. She absorbed the white noise of his heating unit, the distant Heels, rhythmic ticking of a clock measuring his isolation. The psychological pressure was peaking. I must request a behavioral sacrifice, he stated softly. Heels, and I require you to decline if necessary. Rejection is a completely acceptable metric. I will present the data, followed by the inquiry, and you will process it without time constraints. Understood. Understood. Feels. He presented the variables clinically, devoid of emotional padding. The syndicate summit, Vittorio. The Chesapeake coordinates, the stark psychological consequences of her attendance versus her avoidance. He eliminated all false reassurances, feels, delivering the unfiltered pathology of the situation. He cautioned that she would be confined with 9 apex sociopaths governing the eastern seaboard. Men completely desensitized to violence. Moreover, feels, one specific megalomaniac had already weaponized her identity, utilizing her as the catalyst to usurp a leadership position his cousin had controlled for 15 years. Notice Leia's face here, harshly lit by the screen. Feels, she simply absorbed the trauma in absolute silence. Feels. She exhibited total catatonia. Trapped in the sensory-deprived bedroom, she forced the device against her skull until it caused physical pain, internalizing the devastating threat. Eventually, a massive depressive silence anchored them both. Adrian, feels. Proceed. May I request data first? Anything. If I establish a boundary, if I decline, what is the actual consequence this Sunday? He regulated his breathing. Vittorio diagnoses me as a coward hiding an asset, feels. He manipulates that into evidence of my mental unfitness. He lacks the numerical superiority for immediate termination, even holding 5 variables. Their operational codes are incredibly rigid, feels, and I will not overload your processing capacity with them now. But he will fracture my psychological dominance so severely that his next strike will guarantee 7 votes, perhaps 8. So what do you and I conclude? The trap is flawlessly set, feels. Today, you and I are going to analyze Adrian. He measures survival with the cold math of a sociopath. If Vittorio, a textbook megalomaniac, seizes power, Adrian's empire crumbles. When Laia asks if failure means death, his hesitation is fascinating, feels. He explains Vittorio is a far colder monster than his late cousin. Execution is possible. But the darker outcome? Losing his crown. 8 years of systemic control burned to ash, leaving Adrian paralyzed by paranoia for decades, feels. This is the stark reality of Mafia power dynamics delivered without a drop of empathy, feels. Notice the profound psychological tragedy unfolding in this scene. When Laia questions her purpose, Adrian explains her mere presence will force Vittorio into a narcissistic collapse. The narrative shatters, allies scatter, feels. Adrian retains total control while Vittorio suffers humiliating behavioral correction. Then Adrian dangles the ultimate trauma bond, the illusion of a quiet Sunday morning at his kitchen table. Look at Laia in the dark, weeping in utter silence. Feels, a pure autonomic stress response. As a single tear falls, she is quietly swallowed whole by her captor's reality. Feels. Laia tries to rationally process her doom. Just 6 days ago, she was a civilian, pouring coffee, sleeping above a dry cleaner, caring for a sick mother. She realizes facing a predator like Vittorio permanently erases that existence. Feels. She can never return to the diner on Clarendon Boulevard or scrub clinic floors. The woman she was last Friday faces total ego death. Adrian confirms this loss with perfectly calibrated grief, treating her past self as a casualty. Feels. But in a striking display of Stockholm Syndrome, Laia cuts him off, refusing to abandon the mission. Feels. She voices her cognitive dissonance, desperately clinging to a shred of autonomy. She admits to a terrifying psychological pull, the roots of a traumatic bond. Knowing guilt alone will not sustain her when the syndicate stares her down. Feels. She demands a logical anchor. If Sunday turns lethal, who protects her mother? Adrian delivers a masterclass in psychological pacification. He states that a financial trust activates Monday morning. His lawyers will guard her mother indefinitely, feels, regardless of Sunday's bloodshed. He offers this not as a negotiation, but as absolute truth. Feels. He reveals the trust was finalized Wednesday, long before their first dinner. This is pure predatory foresight. Listen to her trembling breath. A subject quietly accepting psychological subjugation. When she asks if Vittorio will leak her identity, feels. Adrian confirms her name will haunt sociopathic circles forever. This is his calculated sacrifice. The scene stretches into agonizing silence, the heavy thud of her pulse, a cheap refrigerator humming, feels. The muffled cough of a street-level foot soldier. Laia finally reaches a chilling realization. This perpetual state of terror is her new reality, regardless of the Chesapeake summit. Feels. Demanding absolute truth, she asks if he loves her. The following silence is a suffocating void. He finally confesses he does, pinpointing the moment she mentioned her cat was named Howard. Despite the looming violence and severe anxiety, feels. Laia lets out an involuntary laugh, a desperate pressure release in the dark. She argues falling in love in 4 days is clinically impossible. Adrian counters with an admission of profound chronic isolation, Eels, confessing he has stood detached in grand rooms surrounded by women of far greater power. Eels, let us evaluate this confession together, you and I. He claims no one in 20 years made him smile over a stray cat, insisting this is not a calculated move. The pathology surfaces when his uncle asked if she was worth a mafia war. Adrian hesitated, Eels. For an apex predator, uncertainty is terrifying. He frames this loss of control as absolute proof of love. Laya falls mute, stifling a sob as the trauma bond tightens. Dropping his voice to a velvet whisper, he demands zero reciprocation. Eels. He just refuses to die Sunday holding this secret. The psychological burden is now hers. Eels. Bearing his soul, he arms her with the data needed for Sunday. Nodding into the dark as a coping mechanism, she commits to the operation. Adrian offers a fake sense of agency, telling her to decide tomorrow. She shatters the illusion, Eels. Confirming she will walk into Chesapeake to face the megalomaniacs. She cannot promise her mind will not fracture, but she vows not to break. Her voice snags on genuine terror, setting one boundary. If she survives this lethal exposure, Eels, they will dissect the ruins of her former life on Monday morning. Eels. She demands the raw truth as a condition for surviving. He agrees. When he offers gratitude, she sharply rejects it, refusing praise for marching into a severe trauma zone. Hearing his exhaustion, she notes it. He admits to severe insomnia. Eels. She ends the call, placing the phone face down. She stares blankly at the ceiling fan, a self-soothing grounding technique. Neurological exhaustion finally drags her to sleep near dawn. By Friday morning, Eels. Profound emotional blunting washes over her, a textbook dissociative state. The die is cast and she feels zero regret. The next 48 hours blur into a surreal, out-of-body fugue, interrupted only by Catalina's quiet arrivals. Eels. Let us examine the family dynamics here. In a stark hospital room, Eleanor grips her daughter's hand, asking zero questions. Laya had explained that Sunday required a dangerous trip with Adrian, promising she would survive by nightfall. Eels. Tethered to an IV drip, her mother simply squeezes Leia's shaking fingers, demanding she return alive. The scene cuts to Saturday. Isabella, a sharp-eyed Portuguese tailor tied to this criminal syndicate for 30 years, Eels, breaches Laya's apartment with garment bags. Operating with absolute emotional detachment, she asks nothing. She takes cold, ruthlessly precise physical measurements to prepare her subject for Sunday's trial. Eels. Isabella reveals the uniform, a modest, high-collared dress the pale color of dying winter wheat. She holds it against Laya's frame. Black and red are strictly forbidden. Eels. She is actively engineering Laya's visual presentation to avoid triggering the room's narcissists, commanding her to project an aura of birthright. When Laya admits complete cognitive confusion, Isabella validates it, Eels, remarking that the arrogant are usually the first to bleed. For 2 hours, the tailor pins fabric. She arms Laya with low heels and a delicate gold chain, a grandmother's heirloom repurposed into psychological armor for the coming war. Eels. Like a behavioral technician, Isabella calibrates Laya's physical responses. She dictates posture, hand placement, and how to lock unblinking eye contact with a predator. She warns the syndicate will try forcing her to speak. Eels. Silence is her only weapon. In this psychological game, the first to speak bleeds dominance, leaving Vittorio and Adrian battling for vocal supremacy. Tilting Laya's chin, Eels. Isabella instructs her to just breathe and study their micro-expressions until Adrian signals. Her final rule is absolute. The sociopaths will try to shatter her psyche and force tears. Crying is strictly forbidden. Eels. The conditioning goes deeper. Never apologize. Never show a victim response by begging Adrian for help. Keep direct visual contact with the aggressor. Isabella frames Leia's past trauma as a weapon, working 3 jobs to keep her mother alive. Eels. These mafia bosses do not understand genuine suffering. Their paranoia makes them afraid of shadows. Leia's existential dread of an empty home has forged her into denser psychological armor. At sundown, Isabella leaves. The dress hangs on the door. Eels, a clinical artifact of the upcoming trial. Kia slumps on the mattress, processes the visual data, and slowly stands. Eels. Notice her acute stress response. She eats mechanically to anchor herself. Calling her mother acts as a dissociative shield, masking profound psychological terror. Finally, Eels. Physical exhaustion forces a biological shutdown, a vault door sealing away the trauma. What do you and I make of this cinematic climax? The Arlington sky mirrors her internal desolation, pale and brittle. At dawn, Eels. Marco drives her to an underground Alexandria garage. Flanked by nameless operatives, Adrian waits by an armored Mercedes. Despite his sharp charcoal suit, his micro-expressions betray severe psychological torment and acute sleep deprivation. Feels. Notice the tension, a violent jaw twitch instantly buried beneath an icy exterior. You look beautiful, he said. Isabella chose it, she replied. I know, she said I did not deserve you. I agreed. He shut the heavy door, Feels, locking them inside the car's quiet luxury. They drove east toward the Chesapeake, heading to an estate built on 90 years of inherited violence. Silence hung heavy. Adrian held her hand, his stillness unsettling. Leia watched the dying trees pass by, Feels, her heart hammering. She studied his fractured profile, the rigid jaw, the faded scar, and the pulse throbbing at his temple. Feels. You and I are watching a strange kind of loyalty take root here. She walked into the lion's den willingly, entirely to support the man holding her captive. Survival instincts vanished into thin air. Feels. The sprawling Chesapeake property wasn't a marble palace, but a weathered stone ghost watching the cold water, complete with a private chapel and dead oak trees. Planted in 1937, Adrian murmured, his breath heavy with dread. Feels. Armored vehicles crowded the gravel like iron beetles. Armed guards watched the Mercedes, giving Adrian grave nods while treating Leia like a ghost. On the porch, Adrian's uncle waited in the shadows. Feels. The patriarch looked physically frail but radiated terrifying authority. He was about 70, wearing a massive gold ring. His eyes held the flat, hollow stare of a man who had seen and ordered unspeakable things. Salvatore Moretti took her hand, Feels, reading her fear with chilling ease. Miss Hart, he rasped, his voice smoothed by decades of power. I have heard much about you. He leaned in uncomfortably close. You understand the danger inside? Yes, sir. You are not to speak. Adrian will speak. Feels. I will speak. Vittorio will talk endlessly. You remain entirely silent. Understood? Leia's breathing hitched. Yes, sir, I understand. Good. Feels. Salvatore held her gaze, testing her courage. Ah, you will do, he whispered, leading her into the dark manor. They stepped into a massive hall, weighed down by heavy wooden beams and a roaring fire. Feels. 8 hardened enforcers and 1 woman sat around a giant table. The woman met Leia's eyes briefly. Renata the Forger. She immediately looked away, swallowed by obvious guilt. At the head of the table sat Vittorio, a towering figure. Feels. A lifetime of unchecked ego and cruelty had twisted his face into a mask of brutal pride. Feels. Vittorio played the absolute tyrant perfectly. He refused to stand, using his posture as a weapon, savoring their arrival like a predator playing with its food. Adrian guided Leia to the far end, placing his own body as a shield on her left, Feels, while Salvatore took the right. The chair beside Vittorio sat empty, holding only weaponized legal papers. We will begin, Salvatore announced, his voice slicing through the thick air. Vittorio flashed a dangerous smile. Cousin, he purred. Feels, using a fake warmth meant to draw out fear. Leia felt the panic rush through her veins. Feels. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Miss, forgive me. I do not know your family name. Adrian snapped defensively. Ah, Miss Hart, welcome to our home. Adrian immediately marked his territory. She is my guest. She will not be addressed directly. Feels. Vittorio waved the rule away like a nuisance. I am merely curious. What exactly does Miss Hart do for a living? The dread in the room's spiked. She is my guest, Adrian repeated. Then, breaking every rule she was taught, Leia spoke up. I am a waitress. Feels. The room froze. Isabella's warning echoed. Silence is power. Had she ruined everything? Feels. She threw her only shield out the window. She recognized the cruel spark in Vittorio's eyes, the thrill of tearing down an enemy in front of the family. Instead of running, Leia felt a sudden need to protect her captor. A waitress, Vittorio sneered, Feels, turning the word into an insult. Yes, she said. At what establishment? I am between jobs. Last week I served at a Washington Gala. Before that, a dirty diner, a Rosslyn coffee shop, and scrubbing a dental clinic floor every night. Feels. She wore her working-class reality like thick armor. Feels. Let's look closely at this moment of absolute defiance. I have done telemarketing hostessing, answered clinic phones. Leia continued, her posture unbending. I am 26. Feels. I abandoned my university degree when my mother's body began failing from stage 3 lymphoma. Is there any other tragedy this table wishes to pick apart? The room was stunned. Salvatore let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh. Feels. Vittorio kept his forced smile, but his arrogant mask cracked. And how, Miss Hart, did you trap our Adrian? I was carrying champagne, she replied, completely fearless. My mother collapsed, and he saved us. Feels. Notice how she shifts the power dynamic here. That is how I met Adrian, Leela stated clearly. Vittorio pushed harder. You didn't know who he was? You are absolutely sure? I had never heard the name Moretti before last Friday, she insisted. Sir, Eels. I grew up in Alexandria. My father taught history before he died. My mother was a librarian. I don't belong to your crime syndicate. I didn't know Adrian. She stared right back into the eyes of their worst monster. I do not know you either. I am sorry. Eels. Down the table, a guard muffled a sudden laugh. Eels. Vittorio ground his teeth tight enough to crack bone. I see, he managed to say. I am sorry if I was rude, Lila countered smoothly. Not at all, it is refreshing. But if you lack mafia ties, Eels, and you are just a waitress with a sick mother, what exactly are you doing in our house today? This was the tipping point. The tension in the room was so thick you could choke on it. Nobody breathed. Lila kept her eyes away from Adrian, Eels. Remembering her training, she ignored Salvatore entirely. She kept her gaze locked on Vittorio, her voice devastatingly quiet but unbroken. Eels. I am here because Adrian asked me. Vittorio scoffed loudly. It is the only one I have, she replied. I don't know the rules of this room. We all know what I am. I am just a waitress who sat across from a man 6 days ago. Eels. A man who showed me his violent, bloody world without lying and asked to see me again. I came. He called at 2 in the morning, laid how dangerous today would be with total honesty. He asked me to stand by him. I did. Eels. I am not here because I am worthy. I am here because a man drowning in lies asked me a real question and took my honest answer without blinking. I will return that loyalty. Eels. You and I have to pause here. This is the heart of the story. I will not. Her voice shook, but she swallowed the emotion down. I will not be the reason he regrets asking. A suffocating silence dropped over the table. Vittorio looked at the legal papers. Eels. Glanced at Adrian, and finally locked on to Lila. Miss Hart, he murmured quietly. She didn't even have to think. The question hit the air, and her wounded heart answered for her. A beautiful, tragic reflex, Eels. She realized she had never told Adrian how she felt. She was confessing her love out loud for the first time, to a jury of 9 killers. Eels. It wasn't a choice. It was pure instinct. Yes, she said. Adrian didn't move a muscle. He kept his eyes straight ahead, but underneath the table, his hand gripped hers like a vise. Vittorio watched her carefully, a slow, Eels, cruel smile spreading across his face. Well, cousin, he remarked, congratulations. You found a very interesting girl. Yes, I have, Adrian replied, his voice flat. We still have business to settle, Vittorio pressed. The paperwork here, Eels, the question of who leads. Then make your move, Vittorio, Adrian fired back, refusing to back down. The floor is yours. You really want to tear him down with her watching? Eels. You set this trap while she was in the room, the second you dragged her into family business. Adrian shot back. You don't get to complain about the rules now. Vittorio's face tightened. You could see the shock of a hunter realizing his prey had fangs. Eels. Then, he pivoted to his usual manipulation. He used history as a weapon, preaching about a century of mafia bloodlines. He warned against letting leaders bring civilian weakness into the syndicate. Staring right at Leela, he tried to isolate her, Eels, condemning a boss ruined by empathy. Leela felt no fear at all. She just sat there, staring right through him. Eels. She simply breathed, locking eyes with whoever held the floor. When Vittorio turned his inflated ego her way, she didn't blink. She stayed completely silent. Adrian had signaled her to speak, and Isabella had trained her well. In this underworld, Eels, silence isn't just quiet, it's a loaded gun. Her one previous remark had already rattled their entire foundation. Across the heavy mahogany table, Renata watched her carefully. Halfway through Vittorio's unhinged rant, Renata looked away. Eels. With agonizing slowness, battling her own internal conflict, she reached out. Using just 2 fingers, she slid her signed contract to the middle of the table, cutting the cord on her alliance with Vittorio. Salvatore caught the tiny shift. Eels, his eyes dipped just once. Eels, let's break down this power shift together. When Vittorio finally ran out of breath, the silence was deafening. Salvatore cleared his throat. Vittorio, he murmured, his voice laced with careful poison, you brought 5 signatures to this ambush. Eels, but one ally just jumped ship. Renata? Vittorio snapped, his pride instantly wounded. Uncle, Renata answered, her voice cold and final. I am withdrawing my name. Vittorio actually flinched. Renata, I am withdrawing my name, Vittorio. Why? Eels. Because my judgment was wrong. You could hear the entire room suck in a breath. Well, Salvatore purred with a shark's calm. 4 signatures against 5. By our family rules, this meeting is over. We are adjourned. Vittorio froze. Feels, completely paralyzed by the sudden checkmate. Feels. A twitch in his jaw leaked Vittorio's buried rage. He looked at Adrian, then Lilala, before locking a dead stare onto Renata. It's a look we often see in true crime. He was burning her face into his mind for future payback. Standing up without a word, Feels. He grabbed his things and marched toward the door. Pausing, he tried one last power play. "Cousin," he said quietly. "Congratulations, Vittorio. We will cross paths soon." "I have no doubt," Adrian fired back. Vittorio walked out. Feels. The heavy door clicked shut. The people left behind let out a massive breath, like they had just avoided drowning. Without thinking, Adrian squeezed Leela's hand hard, a physical reflex anchoring him to the woman who just saved his life. Feels. For one grueling minute after he left, the room stayed dead quiet. The ticking clock sounded like a bomb waiting to go off. A bird shrieked somewhere outside. Lila felt Adrian rubbing her hand, but her skin went ice cold. Feels. It's a classic human reaction. The moment your survival instinct turns off, the terror you push down comes rushing in. Salvatore stood up, his body groaning under the weight of his years. He leaned heavy hands on the oak wood. Feels. Studying the 8 survivors still breathing at his table. "Our family business is done," he announced with total command. Feels. "Go back to your lives. See your wives and children. Lock today away. And pray that Vittorio finds his mind before Adrian is forced to put him in the ground. We are finished." Like clockwork, the men stood. But they didn't just leave. Feels. They engaged in the old rituals of respect. 2 senior members walked up to Adrian. They embraced him, nodded deeply at Lila, and spoke in heavy slang she couldn't catch. A younger guy, who hadn't made a sound all day, walked right up to her. Feels. He bowed his head in pure submission. "Miss Hart," he murmured before slipping out the door. Only Renata stood alone. Feels. Renata stayed rooted near Lila. Her eyes were welling up, but she bit back any tears. Reaching out, she gripped Lila's free hand, steadying her own shaking fingers while she took 3 slow, deep breaths. She offered a single nod, the quiet, Feels. Fatalistic surrender of someone who knows she just signed her own death warrant, then walked away. Salvatore waited until the room was completely empty. He drank his water fast, looking deeply drained. Setting the glass down, he stared at the girl. Feels. For the first time in 30 years, the old mob boss dropped his mask, revealing the sheer exhaustion of an aging man. Feels. "Miss Hart," Salvatore sighed, letting the tension go. "May I call you Leela?" She gave a small nod. "Leela, you need to grasp exactly what you broke today. Stick with me here, because this is where the dynamic gets brilliant." Feels. "Vittorio built this trap for 4 years," Salvatore explained. "Every favor, every bribe, every seat at this table. He spent years grooming these men for this exact hour. He walked in here with 5 promises and a perfect script in his head." Feels. "But in all his paranoid planning, he assumed the woman in your chair would panic. He expected you to scream for Adrian to save you." Feels. "Think about the history of this family. No woman had ever looked this apex predator dead in the eye and honestly claimed she had no idea who he was. Look at the old man's face here, a strange mix of deep sadness and fatherly pride." Feels. "You completely shattered his ego with a handful of words," he murmured. "I don't know you either. I'm sorry." The room seemed to grow darker. "That line is burned into my mind forever, Laya." "I didn't plan it," she said. Feels. "Your lack of planning is exactly why it worked." If she had played the tough mob wife, Vittorio would have chewed her up. He choked on his own words because he collided with something real. Genuine innocence is an alien concept in our world. Feels. "We don't know how to fight it." Watch how his eyes shift to Adrian now. "Napot." A word, an absolute command. Adrian stood up. Giving Laya's shoulder a reassuring squeeze, he followed the old boss toward the fireplace. The visual contrast is striking. Feels. 2 hardened killers hashing out a blood feud in hushed slang for 3 solid minutes. Feels. Let's pay attention to what Laya is observing. Even without understanding their language, she read their body language perfectly. She saw the aggressive grip on Adrian's arm. She noticed how Adrian slowly bowed his head in submission. Feels. She caught the sharp bark from Salvatore that made Adrian flinch. A bitter generational gang war was settled right there in the shadows. Watch Adrian as he walks back to her. His eyes are entirely different now, stripped of calm. Feels. Haunted by whatever he just agreed to. "We are clear to go," he said. "Okay." He hesitated, clearly weighed down by a massive secret. "The boss is formally inviting you to Sunday dinner. You don't have to answer right now. Think about it, but understand." Feels. An invitation like this means everything. His posture screamed that his life depended on it. "Say yes, Laya." Feels. "Tell him yes, Adrian." He nodded tightly, stepping back into the shadows beside Salvatore. The aging Don's face twisted into a rare, genuine smile. Watch this final display of acceptance. He kissed Adrian on both cheeks, heels. Then he turned to Laia, taking both her arms. He leaned down, kissing her cheek with all the dramatic flair of old-world royalty. It's a calculated piece of mob theater, but it leaves you entirely breathless. Sunday, Miss Hart, 6 p.m. Heels. We will eat far too much, and my staff will scold me about the salt. It is the greatest honor I can offer. It means everything. Her voice never wavered. I'll be there, sir. Good girl. You and I both know the danger isn't over. Heels. As they walk down that long hallway, look at Adrian's protective stance. His hand hovers right behind her back. He's guarding his most precious asset, not quite touching her, just watching. Heels. Moving into the entry zone. Isabella stood guard under the harsh lights. We now know she took a separate car, cutting the risk of a violent ambush. But seeing the pure exhaustion etched into Laia's face, Isabella simply offered a single nod, a quiet heels, human acknowledgement of what she just survived. The drive to Washington was suffocatingly quiet. Adrian held his hand tightly, anchoring her in their shared nightmare. Outside, the dying November scenery rolled by like a fading memory. Heels. 30 miles of heavy silence. Finally, catching her own reflection in the glass, Laia broke the quiet. Adrian. Yes. Heels. Did I say it out loud? Yes. Right in front of 9 syndicate bosses, before I even told you. Yes. I am so sorry. Laia, stop. His voice actually cracked, heavy with an emotion he could barely contain. He swallowed hard. Don't apologize. Heels. It is the most real thing anyone has ever given me in this poisoned life. I refuse to feel bad about it, and you need to stop too. Okay. Laia. I fell for you hard on Thursday. It got worse today. By tomorrow, this pull is going to become dangerous. Heels. I needed you to know. She hid her face against his chest. Silent tears soaked his shirt, completely mirroring the breakdown she had days ago. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close like stolen treasure, absolutely terrified of letting go. Heels. He just let her cry against him. He did not offer any empty promises about the future, because their world was built on shifting sand. His read on the room was dead on. Vittorio was a pure narcissist, entirely incapable of genuine change. Heels. The old man knew exactly who he was, and Adrian saw right through him. Even Laia felt the danger after just 30 seconds in the same room. Men like Vittorio do not suddenly find their conscience. Heels. They just step back into the shadows to sharpen their knives. What followed was a fragile 4-month truce. The weather turned bitter cold. Every Sunday, Adrian walked Laia right back into the lion's den. Despite the crushing anxiety, Heels, she slowly mapped out their twisted family tree. The old patriarch would watch her mix up names and forget the bloody history of his relatives, smiling pleasantly, never bothering to correct her innocent mistakes. Heels. Today, you and I are going to unpack how this strange dynamic actually worked. We watch Laia slowly absorb the family secrets. Who married for love? Who married for power? And whose old grudges drove the bloodletting. Heels. She simply was not built for this life. She was just a normal girl from Alexandria, completely out of place in their velvet-lined rooms. Yet, somehow the Mafia embraced her. Salvatore grew fiercely protective. Renata, Heels, who usually washed blood money without blinking, found a real friend in her. By February, even the hardened elders had dropped their guard, charmed by her exhausted warmth. Laia did not have a manipulative bone in her body. Heels. For a crime family suffocating under decades of lies and paranoia, her simple honesty felt like taking a deep breath of fresh air. Heels. The real test started in December. By mid-January, her mother Eleanor was recovering at a pace the doctors called a miracle. Let us jump ahead to March. Picture the scene through the kitchen window. Laia stood perfectly still, Heels, watching her frail mother walk by the freezing river, leaning heavily on Adrian's arm. Eleanor was still fragile, haunted by dark memories, but she was finding her footing. Heels. Think about what Laia was seeing. Her broken mother holding on to the very predator who saved her life that dark November night. A heavy ache gripped Laia's chest. It was not happiness. It was not grief. It was the crushing, Heels, breathless weight of a bond forged entirely out of the desperate need to survive. Heels. It was a messy, raw kind of gratitude, the bone-deep exhaustion that hits you when you finally stop running for your life. The heavy burden of making it through the storm without any real way to heal. Then came the spark that lit the final fire. Heels. A freezing Tuesday in March, a young man was shot dead on the streets of Baltimore. He was just a low-level guy in Adrian's crew, a 26-year-old cousin running a completely legal errand. Adrian had been quietly, desperately trying to pull his family out of the underworld, and he was moving much faster than anyone realized. Shot at close range. The killer sped off on a motorcycle, leaving no witnesses and no final words. Dominic left behind a terrified pregnant wife. Look at the chilling contrast here. Adrian got the text at 11:47 p.m. He was sitting on Laya's old couch with a bowl of popcorn, just trying to play house. The phone buzzed. Watch the humanity drain from his eyes. His face turned to cold stone, a mask Laya had never seen before. He stood, walked into the kitchen, and spoke quietly for 2 minutes. When he returned, he dropped onto the couch, stared right through Laya, and said, "I have to go to Baltimore tonight." Dominic is dead. Oh my God. I will be back tomorrow with 2 guards. Marco is outside with 2 guards. Lock the doors and stay inside until you hear from me. Adrian, I know. Is this Vittorio? The silence in the room suddenly felt suffocating. Yes, he finally admitted. Are you sure? I am sure. What are you going to do? Watch how he anchors himself in the moment. He looked at Laya. He looked at Eleanor, whose tired eyes already showed the fear of someone expecting the worst. He stared blankly at the popcorn bowl. I am going to do the last thing I ever wanted. He literally looked sick to his stomach. I will sit down with Vittorio and my uncle. I am giving him one last chance to walk away from this murder. To walk away from whatever slaughter he is currently planning. To surrender his grip on this crime family. I only offer this peace because Salvatore begged. Because Dominic's mother is drowning in grief, and she doesn't need a mafia bloodbath shadowing the funeral. You and I must see the profound weight here. His jaw clenched tightly under the immense pressure. Whether he takes the exit is his choice. Adrian, Laya, I won't lie to you. We made a promise in November, and I am keeping it. If Vittorio chooses war, I must unleash the very violence I've kept chained since I was 26. I will end it. Coldly. You will stay far away from that poison. And once the threat is buried, I will come back to you. I'll tell you every dark detail. No secrets. That's a promise. Leia watched him. She knew loving him carried a heavy toll, a dangerous entanglement she silently accepted back in November. Okay, she whispered, her voice shaking. Okay, come back to me. I will. He leaned in with a quiet vulnerability, kissing her forehead, a tenderness so foreign to his ruthless world, it broke her walls. Then he vanished into the night. The heavy door locked. Catalina arrived soon after, looking utterly drained. As the silence swallowed them, Eleanor gripped her daughter's trembling hand, one steadying squeeze. She never let go. Let's piece this timeline together. He vanished for 34 hours. When he finally returned, he looked like a ghost, utterly drained, sporting a small cut on his cheek. But the truth is, he didn't pull the trigger. Vittorio actually took the exit. Salvatore later shared what happened. Picture a quiet back room in Little Italy, the air thick with tension. In those final moments, the old man reached across the table. With trembling hands, he held his nephew's face, pleading softly in Italian. My son, please, I already lost your father. Don't make me bury you too. Vittorio was a ruthless man, but underneath lay a deep wound of abandonment. Desperate for his surrogate father's love, the mobster's armor finally broke. Not completely. Of course. Men buried in the underworld rarely find redemption, but something inside him genuinely shifted. Just enough to walk away from the crime family. Enough to move to Florida within a month, leaving his toxic empire behind. He took only his own money and swore an oath to never touch a Moretti again. Amazingly, he kept his word until his last breath. People always wondered what finally broke him. Some guessed paranoia, others thought he was simply exhausted. But 11 years later, as he lay dying at 91, Salvatore held Laya's hand. Struggling for breath, the old patriarch finally revealed the missing piece. He said that inside that quiet restaurant, the untouchable mob boss felt something criminals almost never feel, genuine crippling shame. That was the only closure they would ever get. Fast forward to a crisp October Saturday the following year, when Adrian and Leia finally tied the knot. It looked nothing like a traditional fairy tale wedding. There was no stunning waterfront view. Adrian couldn't stomach building a life near water, a place too stained by mafia violence. They also skipped the Grand Cathedral. As a quiet librarian, Laya had no desire for a flashy spectacle. Instead, they stood inside a weathered, hidden wooden chapel on land Adrian had secretly owned for a decade. It was the exact spot in Virginia he mentioned the very day they met. A true off-the-grid sanctuary, far out of reach from the criminal underworld, feels, where the ghosts of his past could never find him. Feels. What do you and I make of this beautiful picture? The chapel dated back to 1872, sitting quietly by a stream. An old, forgotten orchard rested behind it. In the morning light, the damp, leaf-covered earth glowed like polished copper. Feels. Eleanor walked her daughter down that rustic aisle. She still looked frail, never fully bouncing back from the nightmare of the past August. Yet, she stood incredibly tall, her steps completely steady. Reaching the altar, Feels. She gently lifted Laya's veil and cupped her cheek. In that soft light, Eleanor's face radiated pure, unfiltered joy. It was the deep relief of a mother who had walked through hell. Feels. Marveling at a miracle she never thought she would actually live to see. Feels. I love you, baby, Eleanor whispered. Go on now, he's waiting. Salvatore stood at the front to lead the ceremony. The patriarch had lived without his wife for 22 years. Legally, he had no authority to marry anyone, Feels, but Adrian's lawyers pulled massive strings to make it happen. As he read the vows, the old man's hands visibly shook, stopping twice just to catch his breath. Renata stood by as maid of honor. Marco, the famously stone-cold getaway driver, Feels, stood beside Adrian, looking uncomfortable in a stiff suit. But midway through the vows, tears suddenly spilled down Marco's face. It was a beautiful shattering of his tough guy armor that stunned everyone in the room, but mostly, Feels, it shocked Marco himself. Feels. Let's look closer at this wedding. In the back row, Margaret is sobbing uncontrollably, a delayed emotional release of the sheer terror they had all survived. Up at the altar, Adrian's cool composure completely crumbles. Feels. His hands physically shake as he reads his vows. Leia watches this sudden vulnerability unfold. Leia Hart, he says, his voice tight. I met you in a room built entirely on lies. You were the very first real thing I felt in years. Feels. I spent 2 decades suffocating inside that criminal world. I had given up on any normal life. I walked into that room planning to just fade away and disappear. Feels. But I'm standing here today, he continues, eyes locked onto hers, because you walked past me in pure distress. A single tear fell, and my armor just cracked. For reasons I couldn't understand then, and still struggle to explain, Feels. 8 long years of building walls completely shattered. In 90 seconds, I realized my entire dark empire was just a waiting room for you. He swallows hard. I am not an easy man. My moral compass is far more broken than most. Feels. I won't stand here and pretend I can just erase my past. But I make you this promise. Starting today, I will rebuild myself into the man you see in me. The good man I thought died long ago. Feels. I'm going to slip, Adrian tells her, the weight of his past obvious. I'll make small mistakes every week and probably face a total breakdown eventually. When that happens, you have to break the cycle. We reset. That's the only way I survive this. Feels. Leia's response in this scene is incredibly brief, just 11 words. She's already confessed her struggle with performing for a crowd and gave her grace. Now she just says, I love you, I see you, I know you, I'm staying right here. The officiant, Feels, sweating through his own nerves, seals the marriage. Adrian pulls her close. Instantly, Leia reaches up, holding his face in her hands. It's a grounding mechanism they forged back in November during their desperate escape, echoing right here at the altar. Feels. She has to touch him to prove he's real, physically anchoring them both as their chaotic world finally starts to quiet down. Feels. You and I have to look past the romanticized Mafia endings Hollywood usually sells us. Years later, sitting on that exact same Virginia porch at 60, Leia struggled to explain their healing era to her teenage daughter. Eleanor, Feels, now 17 and stressing over college applications, wanted to know how they actually moved on. Leia smiled, trying to explain how living in pure survival mode eventually just dissolves into quiet routine. Feels. It was thousands of mornings simply measuring coffee. Endless late nights watching Adrian work with lawyers to aggressively wash the blood off his family's money. But there was real peace too. Quiet weekends out at the farm, Feels. A safe haven they only claimed after a fading Salvatore finally handed over the deed. Feels. Their new normal anchored itself around simple Sunday dinners. That quiet rhythm held steady until Leia's mother, Eleanor, passed away peacefully in her sleep at 74. It was a gentle exit. Before she died, Feels. She called those final years a beautiful pardon from a death sentence she had already accepted. But the couple's true redemption really takes shape in their second year together. You can see the idea brewing in Leia for months, Feels. Picture this winter scene, Leia taking over Adrian's desk, designing a medical rescue fund from scratch. She completely rejects the ego-driven charity model. Having watched the healthcare system brutally abandon her mother, feels. Leia channels her rage into action. She builds a direct lifeline for desperate families, turning her own deepest trauma into a shield for others, feels. She designs this entire system for the kid forced to grow up too fast. The teenager who finds their mom collapsed on the kitchen floor, only to hit a brick wall of insurance denials, feels. Leia doesn't care about throwing flashy galas or rubbing elbows with wealthy donors looking for a photo op. Her blueprint is purely functional. A simple phone number a terrified kid can call at midnight to hear a calm, steady voice, feels. Someone telling them to breathe, asking what medicine they need, checking the dose, and getting their address. Just one promise: we are coming to help. Adrian listens to her pitch in total silence. If you look closely at his face here, feels, you see the physical cost of his guilt. Deep lines around his eyes that weren't there 2 years ago, feels. He finally puts the paperwork down. What's the price tag? There isn't a hard number, she admits. It entirely depends on how many people we have to save. Give me a worst-case guess. Say we hit 200 cases a year, feels. Maybe 15 to 20 million to get it off the ground, she replies. Adrian doesn't even blink at the cost. Build it, he tells her. She hesitates, stunned. Do it, he pushes. This mafia money is just sitting there rotting, feels. I've spent years trying to scrub the violence out of it. Leia, this is how we buy our souls back. You run the ship. I write the checks. You answer to absolutely no one. He looks back down at her notes. My only rule is you name it after your mother. Feels. She just stares at him. The Eleanor Hart Foundation. Notice how she doesn't cry here. Her ability to shed tears has been completely burned away by years of grief and living in constant fear. Sometimes emotional weight is just too heavy for crying, feels. Instead, she gives a single nod, reaches out, and presses her hand to his cheek, that exact same grounding gesture from their wedding day. Done, she says. By the time summer rolls around, the lifeline is live. Somewhere in Ohio, feels. A desperate student shut out by the medical system makes a call at 3 in the morning, feels. The kid dials the number, probably expecting a cold automated menu. Instead, Leia picks up the phone herself. Operating straight out of her kitchen, she personally fields every single crisis call during those early days, feels, absorbing all that raw human panic. This is the Eleanor Hart Foundation, she answers, her voice steady and warm. I'm Leia. Tell me what's happening. Just take your time. The caller immediately breaks down, feels, spilling their entire nightmare through the tears. Leia takes the notes. By sunrise, a local pharmacy unlocks the medication. By noon, a dying mother is receiving the exact IV treatment that seemed completely impossible just 1 day ago, feels. Monday morning, the Foundation's lawyers go on the attack. After 7 grueling months of fighting, they force the insurance company to pay for the entire recovery. That was case number 1, feels. Leia kept that first file in her desk drawer for 27 years. By winter, the hotline had saved 41 families. 5 years in, 400. A decade down the line, 3,000 lives, feels. But the Foundation never turns into a corporate machine. You never see the name plastered across the evening news. Leia refuses to play the fame game, turning down every single chance to be celebrated. She didn't need the applause, feels. Her only goal was answering the phone when someone's world ended at 3 in the morning. Meanwhile, Adrian is methodically tearing down his family's toxic empire. He's slowly dismantling the dark Moretti legacy, feels, trying to turn poison into something decent. He sells off the shipping routes. He cuts the dirty union ties. He forces the construction business to finally go legit, feels. But let's look at this closely. Walking away from the Mafia always comes with a brutal price. His own blood relatives turn vicious, completely freezing him out for daring to break their cycle of violence, feels. Adrian gladly trades his toxic family ties just to finally sleep through the night. It's a heavy bargain, but he makes it without looking back. 12 years into this healing marriage, feels, he hands over the keys to the remaining syndicate to his younger cousin Luca. Sitting at that table, old Salvatore actually breaks down crying. A lifetime of mob trauma just spilling out of him. Luca had been quietly learning the ropes for 6 years, feels. But here's the brilliant twist. Luca actually has a conscience, empathy, something the brutal old-school Moretti bosses never had a single drop of, feels. Now stick with me here, because this shift is crucial. Luca totally dismantles whatever crime is left. By the time Adrian's daughter, Eleanor, turned 17, the once terrifying Moretti empire is nothing but a ghost, feels. All that's left is a quiet farmhouse and a normal family life. But outrunning your past always leaves a mark. If we look back 11 years earlier, there's a pivotal moment. Adrian suffers a massive heart attack, feels, trapped in a hospital bed for 18 days. Watching his monitors beep, Leia suddenly faces a dark, terrifying truth about her own lingering trauma bond to him. Feels. She was paralyzed by pure, unadulterated fear, the sheer terror of losing the one person who had completely rewritten her sense of safety. It's a classic hallmark of deep Stockholm syndrome. But Adrian pulls through. He comes home, feels, completely drops the drinking, and gets strict about his health. He starts this daily ritual of pacing the entire property line every single morning. And beautifully tragically, Leia follows him out there, even in the freezing rain, feels. That isn't just love. It's a profound trauma response. She physically needs to know the man holding her world together is still breathing, feels. We also get these beautiful glimpses of ordinary life returning. They adopt a dog. Adrian, a man raised in brutal street violence, tries his hand at growing a garden. Then old Salvatore finally passes away at 91, feels. In his final moments of clarity, he ignores his own sons and gives his ultimate respect to Leia. He admits she was the only thing that brought peace to their violent world. Not long after, little Eleanor is born. A total surprise, feels. 14 years into their marriage. Laja was 42, Adrian 54. That pregnancy threw Leia into massive hypervigilance, a heavy shadow of trauma she could never quite put into words, feels. When their little girl was born, Adrian completely broke down. He wept with a raw intensity never shown during his brutal years in the mob. Staring at his newborn, every last wall inside him crumbled. He whispered that he'd been waiting for her, feels. They named the baby Eleanor Ruth. Ruth was Adrian's late mother. Psychologically, passing down that name was a profound, long overdue release of grief, feels. It finally gave the hardened pieces of a 6-year-old orphan permission to mourn the mother he lost half a century ago, feels. Their child grew up beautifully normal, completely untouched by the family's bloody past. She was smart, and like most teenage girls, she eventually gravitated more toward her mother, a natural shift that gave Leia incredible peace of mind, feels. Sitting on the porch, the 17-year-old asked her mother about the dark days they survived. Leia let the quiet linger. Inside the house, the old 69-year-old crime boss was just making dinner, entirely stripped of his terrifying power. Feels a beautiful, profound change. Feels. Leia's answer shows the quiet reality of surviving trauma. She explained that winning does not happen during the massive fights or the narrow escapes from bad men. The real victory is found on a boring, repetitive Tuesday. It is surviving silly household arguments and still wanting to be near the man who once trapped you. It is sitting on a porch, talking about grocery lists, completely free from the shadow of violence. Feels. She told her daughter that the beginning is the easy part. You and I have probably learned this by now too. The real work is waking up and choosing to hold on to that bond every single day, even when the romance fades and you both grow older. She brushed off all their violent history as nothing more than old ghost stories. Eleanor listened, then bluntly said that was not a very inspiring story. Leia just laughed. That same loud, beautiful laugh that broke down Adrian's walls all those years ago. Feels. She admitted it wasn't a fairy tale, but their teenager was finally old enough to handle the bare truth. A sudden crash from the kitchen shattered the moment. Adrian was yelling, begging for her help with a ruined dinner. As Laja stood, Feels, the quiet agony of her 60-year-old joints told a story of its own. Murmuring a warm motherly promise, she stepped into the kitchen. Adrian stood there waiting. At 69, he was frail, Feels, his lifetime of scars exposed as he stared helplessly at the burnt mess. So, what do you and I make of these two? It is a brilliant portrait of human survival, Feels. Let us look closely at this quiet moment. Watch how his face changes the second she steps close to him. He drops the heavy armor he wears for the rest of the world, revealing a profound and selective vulnerability. He admits he ruined the meal, Feels, and she offers instant, gentle forgiveness. When he suggests breaking their strict routine to order takeout, she reminds him they never bend those rules. Then she closes the distance, Feels. She presses a hand to his cheek, the exact same touch she used to ground him during their darkest, bloodiest days. A new dynamic is born, and he actually laughs, Feels. It is a real chest-deep sound, a raw display of joy that the brutal men of his past would have punished as a fatal weakness. He pulls her close, their bond having grown miles beyond the fearful compromises of their youth, Feels. They stand together in the warm kitchen light, shielded from their violent history by simple domestic routines and the ordinary life of their daughter. Outside, the world is still a dark orchard, hiding cold threats in the shadows. But inside, heals. As Laya rests against his shoulder, her restless mind finally finds peace. She breathes in a quiet truth she has rebuilt from the ashes, every single night for 29 years. Heals. So how do we unpack the end of this story? They did not just survive their trauma. They used it as mortar to build an entirely new reality. Defying every odd, they fought to keep their shared world intact day after day. The violence of their past simply does not matter anymore. What matters is the quiet, unbreakable psychological fortress they ruthlessly built with their own hands, holding together until the very end.